I am Erica Powell, and at 51, after 3 decades of service in the United States Army, I thought I was prepared for any battle. I was wrong. The real war began when my husband said, "I've decided to start a new life without you." The words hung in the air of the upscale restaurant where we had gathered to celebrate our daughter's college graduation. Julian, my husband of 28 years, stood there with his champagne flute still raised, his declaration replacing the toast he was supposed to be making to Serena's achievement. The clinking of silverware stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. 50 pairs of eyes darted between Julian and me, but my own gaze caught Kinsley, his young mistress, trying to hide a triumphant smirk at the adjacent table. If you want to know what happens when a colonel is betrayed, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and prepare for a fight where honor is the ultimate weapon. The silence that followed Julian's words wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed down on the room, thick with the unfulfilled expectations of 50 guests. They were waiting for the explosion. They craved the drama, the shattered glass, the screamed accusations, the slap that would echo through the elegant dining room of the Garrison Bistro. They wanted a scene worthy of the betrayal they had just witnessed. My mind, however, didn't register the emotional chaos they anticipated. 30 years in the Army Finance Corps had trained me to react to a crisis, not with panic, but with assessment. In that frozen moment, as the scent of seared scallops and expensive perfume hung in the air, I wasn't a wife. I was an officer conducting battlefield triage. Threat assessment, primary antagonist, Julian Vance, hostile intent confirmed. Secondary asset, Kinsley Thorne, providing adversarial support. High-value personnel to be protected. Serena Powell, my daughter. Mission objective, tactical withdrawal with honor intact. My gaze swept the room, cataloging the faces. These were our friends, our community, officers I'd served with, spouses I'd supported through deployments. Now they were just witnesses, their faces a mixture of pity, discomfort, and a morbid curiosity that turned my stomach. My eyes landed on Susan, sitting at a table with her husband, a fellow officer from Fort Liberty. Just last week, I had spent 4 hours helping her son polish his application essay for West Point, channeling every bit of my experience to give him the best possible chance. Now I watched as her thumbs flew across her phone screen under the white linen tablecloth, her head ducked down. She wasn't sending a message of support. She was breaking the story. The betrayal wasn't just from my husband. The contagion was already spreading. Julian's smug expression began to falter, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected tears. He had planned for a hysterical outburst that would paint him as the long-suffering husband finally escaping a volatile, career-obsessed wife. My silence was a malfunction in his strategy. It was an asymmetrical response he hadn't prepared for. So I did the one thing he could never have anticipated. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a thin, controlled line, a piece of forged steel that didn't touch my eyes. I slowly raised my hand, but not for the champagne flute filled with bubbles of celebration and deceit. I picked up my glass of ice water, condensation clinging to its sides. I held it up, the crystal catching the light, and angled it directly toward him. My voice, when it came, was not a whisper. It was clear, calm, and carried across the silent room with the precise projection of a commanding officer addressing her troops. "Congratulations, Julian," I said, my tone even. "After 28 years, you've finally made a decisive move." The shock in his eyes was my first small victory. The balance of power shifted. He had thrown a grenade, expecting me to fall on it. Instead, I'd picked it up and calmly handed it back to him. The murmur that rippled through the room was no longer one of pity for me, but of stunned confusion directed at him. While he stood there, momentarily disarmed, I executed the next phase of my operation. I reached down to my leather handbag resting by my chair. My movements were fluid and deliberate, with no fumbling, no hesitation. From an inner pocket, I withdrew a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was made of heavy cardstock, the kind used for formal invitations or legal documents. It felt substantial in my hand. It felt like consequence. I didn't look at Julian. I didn't hand it to him. To do so would have been to engage on his terms. Instead, I caught the eye of our waiter, a young man named Carlos, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth right now. I beckoned him over with a slight nod. He approached our table cautiously, as if stepping into a minefield. I leaned in slightly, my voice low but perfectly audible to Susan's table and the one Kinsley was sitting at. "Carlos," I said quietly, "please give this to Mr. Vance, but only after my daughter and I have left the premises." I placed the envelope on a silver tray. It was no longer a personal dispute, it was a formal transaction. I had transformed myself from the humiliated wife into the commander issuing a final, sealed order. The envelope sat there on the tray, a silent, powerful mystery that now commanded the attention of the entire room. The question in Julian's panicked eyes was now on everyone's lips. What the hell is in that envelope? My mission was almost complete. All that remained was securing my daughter. I turned to Serena. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She was in shock, a casualty of a war she hadn't known was being waged. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. My touch was firm, a grounding pressure. "Chin up, soldier," I whispered, my voice now filled with the warmth I had withheld from everyone else. "This is your day. We will not let him take it from you." She looked at me, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. I gave her a reassuring squeeze. "Let's go." I stood, helping her to her feet. With a practiced maternal motion, I smoothed the front of her dress and adjusted the blue and white summa cum laude honor stole that draped over her shoulders. I looked her directly in the eye, communicating a lifetime of strength in a single glance. We are Powells. We do not break. Together, we turned and walked away from the table. We didn't rush. Our steps were measured, our backs straight. We walked past the silent tables, a sea of gaping faces, and I could feel Julian's enraged stare burning into my back. We walked past Kinsley, whose triumphant smirk had been replaced by a look of anxious uncertainty. As the heavy oak door of the restaurant swung shut behind us, it muffled the indoor sounds for a brief second. But then, clearly through the thick wood, we heard it. The violent scrape of a chair being shoved back from a table. And Julian's voice, no longer smooth and confident, but sharp and laced with the first real taste of panic. "What did she do? What the hell is in that envelope?" His question was followed by an eruption of frantic whispers. We didn't stop. We kept walking into the cool North Carolina evening, the sound of his hurried, heavy footsteps starting to follow us from the restaurant door. The first battle was over, and the victory was mine. The engine of my Lexus SUV hummed quietly as we pulled away from the curb, the manicured trees of downtown Fayetteville blurring into the night. Behind us, the sounds of Julian's frantic pursuit faded. Inside the car, a different kind of silence settled, heavier than the one in the restaurant. This one wasn't filled with shock, but with the painful weight of questions that had been unasked for too long. Serena sat beside me in the passenger seat, still in her beautiful graduation dress. The honor stole a vibrant slash of color in the dim light. She stared out the window, her reflection a ghostly image against the passing streetlights. For several minutes, the only sounds were the soft click of the turn signal and her own shaky breaths. Finally, she turned to me, her voice small, fragile. "Mom," she asked, "how long have you known?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. This was the debriefing, the part of the mission where you lay out the intelligence, tracing the path that led from peace to war. "The first threat appeared 6 months ago," I began, my voice steady, betraying none of the cold ache that had taken up permanent residence in my chest since that day. It wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. An automated email notification from our bank, USAA. It was a confirmation for a small business loan that Julian had co-signed as a guarantor. I paused, remembering the moment. I had been at my desk at Fort Liberty, reviewing budget projections for the upcoming fiscal year. The email popped up, and I almost deleted it as spam. To a civilian, it would have looked like nothing, I continued. But to me, It was a red flag the size of a parachute. The registered business address wasn't an office park or a storefront. It was a residential apartment number. Kinsley Thorne's apartment. For Julian, the brilliant ideas man, it was a tiny, insignificant detail he'd overlooked. For Colonel Erica Powell, a finance officer with 3 decades of experience auditing multi-million-dollar military accounts, it was a catastrophic breach of protocol. It was a loose thread on a perfectly woven tapestry. And I began to pull. "You have to understand, Serena," I told her, my voice turning colder, more clinical. "I didn't need to hire a private investigator. I didn't need to hack his phone. Your father made one critical mistake. He underestimated his opponent. For our entire marriage, I was the one who managed our finances. I had access to everything, every credit card statement, every investment account, every tax return. I was the bedrock, the steady income, the military money machine, as he once called me. Late at night, after he was asleep, I would go to my study. I opened a new Excel spreadsheet, password protected with an encryption level that would make the Pentagon proud. I named it Project Nightingale. And I began to build a map. It wasn't a map of a battlefield, but of a betrayal, charted with financial data points. Each transaction was a pin on that map. A $5,000 charge at Tiffany & Co's in Raleigh, not for our anniversary. A series of hotel bookings at the Breakers in Palm Beach during a supposed business conference in Orlando. There were cash withdrawals, always just under the reporting threshold, from ATMs near Kinsley's apartment. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was meticulously documented. I created timelines, flowcharts, cross-referencing dates with his official travel schedule. I wasn't an angry wife snooping. I was a forensic accountant conducting an audit on a fraudulent entity, and the entity was my own marriage. The most painful discovery came when I was reviewing the college fund we had set up for your graduate studies. "Do you remember last Christmas?" I asked Serena, my voice catching for the first time. "When he said he needed to withdraw $20,000. He claimed he had a hot tip on a safe, high-yield municipal bond that would be perfect for your education fund." Serena nodded slowly. "I remember. He said it was his way of contributing." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped my lips. "His contribution," I said, the words tasting like ash, "was the down payment on a brand new BMW convertible. For her." Serena let out a soft, wounded sound, and I reached over, placing a hand on her arm. This was the heart of Julian's deception. It wasn't just the money, it was the contempt. He had always patronized me, treating my career as a quaint, simple-minded hobby. "You just follow orders, Erica," he'd say with a condescending smile. "Let me handle the big-picture thinking." Or his favorite, "The Army's numbers are different from the real world, honey. It's not as complex out here." He saw me as a reliable, predictable utility, a direct deposit that hit our account on the 1st and 15th of every month. He never once considered that the same analytical mind that could track a billion-dollar supply chain for the 82nd Airborne could also trace his pathetic trail of lies. His arrogance, his dismissal of my intelligence, that was the fatal flaw in his plan. It created the very vulnerability I needed to dismantle his entire world. We drove in silence for another mile, the weight of the truth settling between us. Serena finally broke the quiet. "So, the envelope," she asked. "Is it all of this?" "That," I said, a grim satisfaction in my voice, "is the weapon he forged himself, and he handed it to me the day we got married." I explained that years ago when Julian was just starting his first failed business venture, he was the one who insisted on a prenuptial agreement. He wanted to protect his future potential assets from me, the salaried government employee. I had agreed, hurt but pragmatic. I hired my own lawyer, a retired JAG officer, a man who understood the meaning of honor better than anyone. My lawyer added a special clause, I told her, turning onto our street. It's called an infidelity clause, but we gave it a different name. We called it the Honor Clause. Section 12. It states that if either party is found to have engaged in marital infidelity, they forfeit any and all claim to assets generated by the other party's income during the marriage. Serena's eyes widened as she processed the implication. "That's right," I confirmed, pulling into the driveway of the house my salary had paid for. It means the house, the cars, the pension, the investment portfolio, nearly everything. For 28 years, Julian thought that document was his shield. He never realized it was actually my sword. He signed it himself, so eager to protect a future fortune he never earned. He sealed his own fate with a fountain pen and a condescending smile. The man who spent his life underestimating me had just handed me the ammunition for my final, decisive command. After dropping Serena off at the furnished short-term apartment I had quietly leased last week, I drove back alone. Back to the 2-story colonial brick house we had called home for 15 years. The house my salary had secured, my bonuses had renovated, my home. As I pulled into the driveway, I didn't see a sanctuary. I saw a strategic position, a base of operations. Tonight, it was occupied territory, and I was here to reclaim it. I didn't go upstairs to pack his things, or downstairs to weep in the laundry room. I walked directly into the living room and established my command post. I didn't turn on the overhead lights, preferring the shadows. The only illumination came from a single brass lamp on the end table, its warm glow falling across a stack of documents I placed beside it. From the mahogany liquor cabinet, I poured myself 2 fingers of Woodford Reserve bourbon, the amber liquid a stark contrast to the celebratory champagne from earlier. The first sip was a slow, controlled burn, chasing away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I sat down in my wingback chair, the leather cool against my skin, and I waited. An officer never enters a battle unprepared. You secure the high ground, you control the terrain, and you force the enemy to come to you. It took nearly an hour filled with the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that had once been comforting but now felt like a countdown. Then I heard it. The squeal of tires as his Mercedes tore into the driveway, followed by the slam of a car door. The front door burst open without the courtesy of a key or a knock. He stormed in, bringing the scent of rage and expensive cologne with him. Julian stood in the entryway, his face flushed, his perfectly tailored suit jacket now rumpled. He didn't see a wife. He saw an insubordinate who had defied his public execution order. His eyes scanned the dimly lit room and found me. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Erica?" he snarled, his voice a low growl. He strode across the room and without a thought flung his jacket onto the delicate armchair by the fireplace. It was a small Queen Anne chair, upholstered in floral chintz. It had been my mother's. The one piece of furniture she'd left me when she passed. The casual act of disrespect, of claiming even that sacred space as his own, sent a tremor of cold fury through me. He slapped the now crumpled cream envelope onto the coffee table between us. It landed with a pathetic thud, all its earlier power seemingly gone. Serving me divorce papers in the middle of my daughter's graduation party? The arrogance was still there, the deep-seated belief that he, and he alone, was the aggrieved party, that he was still in control. I took another slow sip of my bourbon before answering, my eyes still on the file in front of me. "I believe you mean our daughter," I corrected him calmly. "And I thought the timing was rather poetic, given your own theatrical announcement. You wanted a public spectacle, Julian. I simply provided the appropriate documentation." He let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Oh, this?" He flicked the envelope with his finger. "This is meaningless. That prenup is nearly 30 years old, Erica. Any first-year law student will tell you it's worthless. The court will laugh you out of the room." That's when I finally looked up. I let him see the full, unshielded force of my gaze. It was the same look I gave a junior officer whose accounts were off by $1 million. Cold, analytical, unforgiving. "Actually," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, "my attorney says something quite different. You remember David Chen, don't you? Retired Army colonel, top of his class at Duke Law. He seems to think Section 12, the honor clause, is as valid today as the day you signed it. Your lawyer should have explained that to you." "Oh, wait." I feigned a moment of realization. "You didn't consult a lawyer, did you, Julian? Because that would have required foresight. And admitting you might need help." The blood drained from his face. For the first time since he'd walked in, The mask of arrogant confidence cracked, revealing the panicked, insecure man beneath. He took a half step back, a subconscious retreat. You have no proof, he stammered, the words catching in his throat. I didn't say a word. I simply, slowly, swiveled my laptop on the table to face him. The screen glowed in the dim light. It was open to an audio file. The title was displayed in a clean, bold font, New Life Planning, April 24th. His eyes widened in horror. I pressed the spacebar. His own voice, slick and conspiratorial, filled the silent room. Just one last big withdrawal from the joint account, his recorded voice said. We'll call it a seed investment. Erica won't question it. She's too busy playing soldier to notice the details. Then Kinsley's giggling reply, high-pitched and cruel. Are you sure you can milk that military cow one last time? Honey, Julian's voice oozed with smug confidence. She's been my safety net for almost 30 years. She doesn't know how to say no. I hit the spacebar again, plunging the room back into a deafening silence broken only by the frantic ticking of the clock. Julian stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. He stared at the laptop as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. The color had completely vanished from his face, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. His mouth opened and closed, but no sounds came out. He wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was looking at a stranger, a woman who had gathered intelligence, identified his weaknesses, and laid a perfect, inescapable trap. He had walked into a battle of his own making, armed with ego and bluster, only to find himself facing an opponent with superior firepower, superior strategy, and irrefutable proof. He finally understood. He wasn't in a messy divorce, he was in a war, and he had already lost. After Julian stumbled out of the house, defeated and exposed, a profound silence descended once more. But this was a different kind. It was the hollow quiet that follows a battle, filled with the echo of explosions and the sharp tang of adrenaline turning sour. I stood there in the middle of the living room, the victor on a battlefield I had never wanted, and I felt nothing but a bone-deep exhaustion. The bourbon glass was empty. The house felt vast and cold. For the first time all night, the full weight of my solitude pressed down on me, and I felt the carefully constructed walls of my composure begin to crack. I sank into the wingback chair, my body feeling impossibly heavy. The fight was won, but the war was just beginning. And for a terrifying moment, I felt utterly alone. My fingers found my phone. I scrolled through the contacts, names of colleagues, neighbors, the women from the Officers' Spouses Club. Not one of them felt like a safe harbor. Then my thumb stopped on one name, the one person in Julian's family who had always looked at me not as Julian's wife, but as Erica. My hand hesitated. It was past midnight. It was his sister. But the need for a true ally, for a sanctuary, outweighed everything else. I pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring. Diana, it's Erica. I'm so sorry to call this late. Her voice came through the line, calm and steady, with no trace of surprise. I've been waiting for your call, Erica. Tell me where you are. I'm on my way. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask for details or gossip. Her only questions were logistical, the practical concerns of a veteran soldier coming to the aid of a comrade. Where are you? Do you need me to pick you up? An hour later, I was sitting in the warm, cluttered kitchen of Diana Vance's cozy bungalow in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood just outside Chapel Hill. Her home was the polar opposite of the one I'd just left. Where mine was orderly and spacious, hers was filled to the brim with the comfortable chaos of a life well lived. Books on military history overflowed from shelves, sharing space with framed photographs and honorable discharge certificates. A folded American flag, the kind given to the families of fallen soldiers, sat in a display case on the mantelpiece with quiet reverence. Diana, a retired professor of military history from UNC, was the only member of the Vance family who truly understood the language of service and honor I spoke. She moved around her kitchen with a quiet efficiency, her face etched with a knowing sadness. She placed a steaming bowl in front of me. It was chicken noodle soup, The old-fashioned kind, with thick egg noodles and chunks of carrot and celery. The aroma instantly transported me back 20 years. It smelled exactly like my mother's. I remember you telling me once that your mom always made this for you when you got back from a long deployment, Diana said softly, sitting down across from me with a mug of tea. Thought you could use some tonight? The simple, profound act of kindness did what Julian's cruelty could not. It broke through my defenses. I felt a hot sting behind my eyes, and I could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He's forgotten who we are, Erica, she said, her voice laced with disappointment. Our father was a command sergeant major. He taught us that honor wasn't a word you say, it's a thing you do. Julian. He's been chasing money and status for so long, he's forgotten the core values of this family. I tried to warn him. But he wouldn't listen. Just then, the front door opened and Serena rushed in. Her eyes were red and swollen, but the tears had dried. She was still wearing her graduation dress, a stark reminder of the beautiful day that had been so brutally corrupted. She saw me at the table and flew into my arms, burying her face in my shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mom, she sobbed. I was so wrapped up in my own world. I held her tight, stroking her hair. This is not your fault, I said fiercely. None of it. You are the reason I fight, Serena. You are my mission. As I held her, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from my lawyer, David Chen. The message was brief and clinical, but it was a declaration of another victory. Emergency motion granted. Accounts are frozen. JV has no access. I showed the message to Diana. A grim smile touched her lips. I held my daughter in my arms. In that moment, in that warm, book-filled kitchen, we were no longer just three women. We were a new combat unit, a united front. Our new alliance was tested sooner than I expected. A car screeched to a halt outside, and moments later, there was a furious pounding on Diana's front door. Before any of us could react, the door swung open, and Julian stood there, his face a thunderous mask of rage. Kinsley hovered behind him, looking pale and nervous. Erica, we need to talk, he boomed, stepping into the house as if he owned it. You need to stop this madness right now. You can't just freeze everything. This is insane. I began to rise, ready to face him again, but before I could say a word, a figure moved to stand in front of me. It was Serena. She planted her feet, creating a human shield between her father and me. Her voice when she spoke was no longer the voice of a child. It was clear, cutting, and filled with a pain that had aged her years in just a few hours. Madness? She said, her voice trembling with righteous anger. You want to talk about madness? Madness is a father who decides to detonate his family in the middle of his own daughter's celebration just to feed his pathetic ego. Madness is stealing from our family's savings to buy your girlfriend a car while telling me we had to tighten our belts. You are the one who is insane, Dad. The words struck Julian with more force than any legal document could. He recoiled as if physically slapped. Kinsley's face went white, her eyes darting towards the door, suddenly realizing she had allied herself with the losing side. Julian stood there, speechless, utterly defeated not by a colonel, but by the daughter whose love and respect he had just burned to the ground. After being so thoroughly humiliated at Diana's house, Julian must have realized that a direct confrontation was a battle he couldn't win. He was outmatched in strategy and crippled by a lack of evidence, so, like any cornered coward, he retreated from the front lines and opened up a new theater of war. He switched to psychological operations. The first wave of attack was a classic smear campaign. It started subtly. Whispers in the Fort Liberty commissary line. Awkward silences at the officers' club bar. Kinsley, with her socialite charm and manufactured victimhood, was the perfect delivery system for the poison. She would speak in hushed, tearful tones at family readiness group meetings about how Julian had been so lonely for so long, married to a cold, ambitious woman who cared more about her rank than her husband. The narrative began to take hold. Erica Powell. Oh, she was always so career-obsessed. She neglected that poor man for years. I heard she's jealous of Kinsley's successful new business. The lies, repeated often enough, began to sound like truth in the echo chamber of the military community. Old friends suddenly became too busy for coffee. Invitations to backyard barbecues stopped coming. I was being methodically and quietly isolated, cut off from my own support network. The loneliness was a palpable, chilling ache. But the second wave of attack was far more insidious and far more personal. Julian began to weaponize our past. The emails started a few days after the incident at Diana's. They weren't angry or threatening. They were worse. The first one arrived with the subject line, "Remember this?" Attached was a photo of us from the early 90s, taken on a trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains. We were young, barely 23, wrapped in each other's arms, smiling stupid, happy smiles against a backdrop of autumn leaves. My hair was longer then, and I was wearing his oversized college sweatshirt. Below the photo was a single line of text. "I miss this man. The man I was before your career killed him. Before you killed us." It was classic gaslighting, a masterclass in blame shifting. He was attempting to rewrite 28 years of history, painting me as the villain and himself as the tragic victim. Another email arrived the next day. It was just a link to a YouTube video. "November Rain" by Guns N' Roses. Our song. The song we danced to at our wedding. No text. He didn't need any. The music itself was a ghost, haunting the quiet of my temporary apartment. Day after day, the assault continued. A photo of us bringing a newborn Serena home from the hospital. A picture from my officer candidate school graduation. Him pinning my second lieutenant bars on my collar, beaming with pride. Or what I had once mistaken for pride. Each image, each memory, was a carefully aimed missile designed to breach my emotional defenses, to make me doubt the reality I had uncovered. "Remember when we were happy?" the messages screamed. "That was before you chose the army over me. This is all your fault." For days, I held strong. I was a colonel, after all. I had endured hardships and pressures far greater than a few manipulative emails. But the constant targeted bombardment began to wear me down. The enemy wasn't at the gate. He was inside my head, using my own memories as ammunition. The breaking point came late one night. I was alone, Serena was out with friends, and Diana was at a university function. Another email from Julian popped up. It was a photo of us on the beach in the Outer Banks, laughing as a wave crashed over our feet. We looked so carefree, so in love. And for the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced my resolve. I stared at the smiling face of the young woman I used to be and felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Was he right? A small, treacherous voice whispered in my mind. Did my ambition cost us our happiness? Was my career too high a price to pay? I felt the sting of tears, the first I'd allowed myself since this nightmare began. The carefully constructed fortress around my heart began to crumble. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted me to surrender from within before we ever set foot in a courtroom. The next evening, Diana must have sensed my faltering spirit. She found me staring blankly at my laptop screen, another one of Julian's memory missiles sitting unopened in my inbox. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. Instead, she sat down across from me with 2 steaming mugs of Earl Grey tea and told me a story. "Have you ever studied Ulysses S. Grant's Overland Campaign?" she asked, her professor voice cutting through the fog in my mind. I shook my head. "Grant's generals were terrified," she said. "They were obsessed with Robert E. Lee. Lee's going to do this. Lee's going to flank us here." They were always reacting to what they thought their enemy might do, but Grant wasn't interested in that. When his staff would bring him these panicked reports, he would just say, "I'm tired of hearing about what Lee is going to do. I want to figure out what we are going to do to him." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "Erica, that's what Julian is doing to you. He's trying to drag you onto his battlefield, a battlefield of emotion, nostalgia, and guilt. He wants you to react, to doubt, to fight on his terms. Don't fall for it." She reached out and placed her hand on mine. "Stop thinking about what he is doing to you, and start thinking about what you are going to do to him. Pull him back onto your battlefield, the one of facts, evidence, and consequences." Her words were like a splash of cold water, a direct order that cut through the noise of my self-doubt. She was right. I had allowed the enemy to choose the terrain. It was time to take back command. While Diana watched, I opened my laptop. I didn't open Julian's email. I created a new rule in my inbox settings, one that sent any message from his address directly to a trash folder, unread. Then, I opened my phone, found his contact, and pressed block. A profound sense of quiet settled over me. I had cut off his supply lines. The psychological warfare was over. I was back in control, and the next move would be mine. I had thought that by blocking Julian's calls and emails, I had drawn a clear line in the sand. I had thought I was defining the new terms of engagement. I was wrong. Julian didn't respect lines. When he found his psychological assault blocked, he didn't retreat. He escalated, aiming his next attack not at me, but at the one person he knew was my entire world. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was Serena. Her voice was thin and shaky, distorted by panic. "Mom, something's happened. I just got an email." "From your father?" I asked, my body tensing. "No," she said, her voice cracking. "It's from the financial aid office, at Duke." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, seized me. Serena had been accepted into Duke's prestigious graduate program in public policy, a dream she had worked tirelessly for. It was the proudest moment of my life. "What did it say, honey?" I asked, trying to keep my own voice calm. She took a shaky breath and read from the email. "Dear Miss Powell, following a recent conversation with your father, Mr. Julian Vance, we are writing to follow up on some potential changes to your family's financial circumstances. To ensure your aid package for the upcoming academic year remains accurate, could you please provide updated documentation?" She trailed off into a choked sob, and I didn't need to hear the rest. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear, and a terrifying stillness came over me. The background noise of the world, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, faded to nothing. There was only the ringing in my ears and the image of Julian picking up a phone and deliberately, methodically, attempting to sabotage his own daughter's future. He hadn't just crossed a line. He had taken a torch to the entire map. This was no longer a bitter divorce. This was a scorched earth campaign waged against an innocent. He was willing to sacrifice Serena's dream, her future, all to gain a sliver of leverage over me. In that moment, something inside me broke. Or perhaps it was forged. The anger that rose up wasn't the hot, messy anger of a screaming match. It was a cold, pure, silent fury. It was the calm, focused energy at the core of a nuclear reactor. Every last shred of pity, every lingering ghost of the love I once had for that man, was incinerated. Every doubt, every question of, was it my fault? Vanished in the white-hot certainty of his depravity. I finally saw him for what he was. Not a flawed husband, not a selfish man. He was a hostile entity, a moral vacuum, an enemy who targeted non-combatants. And in the United States Army, we have a clear protocol for dealing with an enemy like that. You neutralize the threat permanently. My movements became sharp, precise. I ended the call with Serena, promising I would handle it. Then, without a moment's hesitation, I dialed my lawyer. David Chen answered immediately. "Erica, is everything okay?" My voice when I spoke was devoid of all emotion. It was the flat, resolute tone of a commander issuing an irrevocable order on the battlefield. "David, change of plan," I said. "What's going on?" "The rules of engagement have been altered. I am no longer interested in a fair settlement. I'm no longer interested in a swift resolution. I want you to execute Section 12 to its fullest extent. I want the house. I want the 401k. I want the investment accounts. I want every single asset his name is on that my income generated. I want you to file for his assumption of all marital debt he incurred. Go after his business partners for the fraudulent loans. No quarter, no negotiation. Is that understood?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. David Chen had handled hundreds of military divorces. He had seen the worst of human behavior. But my tone must have conveyed the absolute shift that had just occurred. When he finally spoke, his voice was just as serious. Understood, Colonel. After the call, I walked down the hall to the guest room where Serena was staying. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her laptop, her face pale with devastation. I sat beside her and pulled her into a fierce, protective hug. I let her cry for a moment, and then I held her at arm's length, forcing her to look at me. Listen to me, Serena, I said, my voice low and steady as a rock. Your father has crossed a line from which there is no return. Until now, I have been on the defensive. I have been reacting. That ends today. I looked her straight in the eye, mother to daughter, commander to soldier. From this moment forward, I am on the attack. I will use every resource, every regulation, and every bit of strength I have to ensure that he can never harm you or anyone else like this again. I promise you that. This wasn't a mother's comfort. It was a warrior's oath. The battle for my dignity was over. The war for my daughter's future had just begun. And I would accept nothing less than unconditional surrender. And if you believe that a child's future should be the one sacred line that no one ever crosses, hit that like button to show your support. For all the parents who would go to war for their children, let me know in the comments by simply writing, "I stand with Serena." My warrior's oath to Serena was not just words, it was a mission directive. The following morning, my grief and rage were compartmentalized, packed away like old uniforms. In their place was a cold, sharp focus. I was no longer a wife fighting for her dignity. I was a commander launching a full-scale offensive. David Chen's law office in downtown Fayetteville became our forward operating base. It wasn't a fancy high-rise firm with mahogany walls and panoramic views. It was a practical, disciplined space run by a retired Army colonel who understood that victory is achieved through meticulous planning, not expensive furniture. We transformed his conference room into a legal war room. We covered a large whiteboard with timelines, color-coded sticky notes, and complex flowcharts that traced Julian's web of deceit. This was my terrain. While David handled the legal doctrine, I handled the data. I spread out 6 months of bank statements, credit card bills, and investment reports across the long table. With a red pen, I circled, highlighted, and cross-referenced every fraudulent transaction. I pointed to a series of charges. Here, I said, my voice crisp and professional. He's coded these payments to a vendor called Vance Innovative Solutions. It's a shell LLC. The payments correspond to the dates Kinsley signed the lease on her apartment and bought her BMW. He wasn't investing, he was laundering our marital assets to finance his affair. David looked from the papers to me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Colonel," he said, shaking his head in admiration, "you're doing half my paralegal's job for them. You're not just building a case, you're writing a prosecution-ready indictment." Our first strategic move was to secure a key witness. "We need to depose Diana," David said, his expression serious. I hesitated. "David, she's his sister. I don't want to put her in that position. It's an impossible choice." "It's also our most powerful psychological weapon," he countered. "Nothing speaks louder to a judge than a man's own family testifying to his lack of character." Before I could argue, I decided the choice had to be Diana's. I called her that afternoon and laid out the situation, making it clear that she could refuse without judgment. Her response was immediate and firm. "Erica, this isn't about loyalty to a name. It's about loyalty to the truth. Julian has to be held accountable for what he's done. Tell David I'll be there." Her integrity was a beacon in the murky fog of this war. With our legal foundation solidifying, I moved to neutralize Julian's logistical support. My 30 years in the finance corps had taught me that, to defeat an enemy, you don't just attack his position, you cut off his supply lines. First, I targeted his access to capital. I knew from his panicked voicemails, which I'd saved but not answered, that he was desperately trying to secure loans from local business partners to cover his frozen accounts. I had David's office draft a formal Notice of Lis Pendens letter. It's a legal document that informs potential creditors that a person's assets are currently the subject of litigation. We sent it via certified mail to every one of his known business contacts. Within 48 hours, his credit lines dried up. No one would lend money to a man whose financial foundation was about to be obliterated in court. Next, I targeted his sanctuary. Julian and Kinsley were living in a high-end luxury apartment complex called the Haymount. I knew for a fact that the security deposit and the first 3 months of rent had been paid from our joint investment account. I drafted a letter myself, this time on my personal letterhead, and sent it to the property management company. The letter was polite, professional, and devastating. It simply informed them that the funds guaranteeing the lease were currently frozen as part of a contentious divorce proceeding involving financial malfeasance, and that future payments were not guaranteed. The attached copy of the court's asset freeze order added the necessary weight. They were now facing eviction. Each action was legal, precise, and executed without emotion. I was systematically dismantling the life he had stolen from me to build. The final, decisive blow came a week later. David called me, his voice electric with the thrill of the hunt. "Erica, we've got him," he said. "We've got the smoking gun." His forensic accounting team had been tracking digital footprints. Just 2 days after the disastrous graduation dinner, and 1 day after my initial divorce filing officially put a temporary restraining order on all marital assets, Julian had attempted an electronic transfer. It was for $250,000 from our Vanguard investment account to a newly created shell corporation in Delaware. "It's a textbook case of fraudulent conveyance," David explained, the excitement clear in his voice. "He willfully violated a court order in a blatant attempt to hide assets. This isn't just unethical, it's illegal. He's shown contempt of court." I leaned back in my chair, a slow, grim sense of finality washing over me. This was the proof. The undeniable, irrefutable evidence of his intent to defraud not just me, but the legal system itself. "The game is over, Colonel," David said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "We're not just going to win, we're going to annihilate him. I'm filing an emergency motion for a hearing on the contempt charge. He'll be in front of a judge by the end of the month." The battlefield was set. The weapons were deployed, and the enemy had just handed me the coordinates for the final, decisive strike. The Cumberland County Courthouse was an imposing brick building, steeped in the kind of institutional silence that makes you feel small. But as I walked through the security checkpoint on the morning of the hearing, I didn't feel small. I felt prepared. I was wearing my dark navy blue suit, the civilian equivalent of my Class A uniform. My posture was straight, my stride was measured. I was a colonel walking into a briefing from which there was only one acceptable outcome. Julian was already there, sitting beside his lawyer. He tried to project an air of confident indignation, but it was a poorly constructed facade. His expensive suit couldn't hide the nervous energy radiating from him, the constant shifting in his seat, the way his eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine. His lawyer, a young man who looked barely out of law school, kept shuffling his papers with a clammy, uncertain air. They looked like amateurs who had stumbled into a war zone. In contrast, I walked to my table and sat beside David Chen. I arranged my single folder neatly in front of me, placed my hands on the table, and fixed my gaze on the judge's empty bench. I didn't look at Julian. I didn't need to. In a battle, you focus on the objective, not the distractions. The stark difference in our demeanors told the entire story before a single word was spoken. The bailiff's call of "all rise" brought us to our feet. Judge Marcus Thorne entered, a tall, imposing African-American man in his late 60s with a shaved head and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. David had briefed me. 25 years in the Marine Corps, retired as a master gunnery sergeant before going to law school. He was a man who understood the language of honor and discipline, and he did not suffer fools. David Chen presented our case with the cold, methodical precision of a surgeon. There was no theatricality, no emotional appeals, just a relentless, systematic presentation of the facts. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because Mr. Vance has shown a pattern of behavior that includes financial fraud, marital infidelity, and, most disturbingly, contempt for this very court." One by one, he laid out the evidence. The bank statements showing laundered money, The Tiffany's receipts for gifts I never received. The hotel bills from Florida. With each piece of evidence presented as an exhibit, I saw Julian shrink a little more in his chair. The audio file of his conversation with Kinsley was played in the silent courtroom, his smug voice bragging about milking the military cow echoing off the wood-paneled walls. But the final, irrefutable blow was the evidence of the illegal transfer. David presented the time-stamped records from Vanguard. Your Honor, less than 24 hours after Colonel Powell's filing placed a legal freeze on all marital assets, Mr. Vance attempted to illegally transfer $250,000 to a shell corporation in Delaware. This is not the action of an estranged husband. This is the action of a criminal. I watched the judge's face. As he looked at the evidence, his expression hardened from stern neutrality into one of open, undisguised contempt. He looked at Julian, not as a judge looking at a respondent, but as a master gunnery sergeant looking at a maggot. Then came the witnesses. Diana took the stand, her presence radiating integrity. She spoke calmly about her brother's increasing obsession with money, his dismissive attitude toward my career, and her shame over his actions. It was a devastating blow to his character. But the true spectacle began when David called his final witness, Kinsley Thorne. She walked to the stand trying to look like a poised, wronged woman, dressed in a demure dress that was a size too small. She tried to play the part of the innocent who had been duped, testifying that she believed Julian and I were already separated. David let her finish her story, then he approached, holding a new set of documents. Ms. Thorne, he said gently, could you please identify this document? He showed her a credit card statement. This is a statement for a card in your name, is it not? Yes, she said cautiously. And could you please read the highlighted charge from May 4th? She paled. It's a charge for a BMW dealership. For $20,000, correct? And was this payment made from your own bank account, Ms. Thorne? Well, no, Julian gave me the money. He gave you the money, David repeated. The very same day that $20,000 was withdrawn from a joint educational fund belonging to Colonel Powell and her daughter. Is that just a coincidence? Kinsley began to panic. Her carefully rehearsed story fell apart under the weight of the evidence. I didn't know where the money came from. He told me it was his own investment money. He said everything was taken care of. She was unraveling, her voice rising in pitch. She whipped her head around and glared at Julian, her eyes wild with fear and betrayal. You told me it was handled, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at him. You said she wouldn't find out. You promised me. The judge banged his gavel. Order, Ms. Thorne, control yourself. But the damage was done. The alliance built on lies had spectacularly self-destructed in open court. The judge did not deliberate for long. He looked down from his bench, his face a mask of cold fury. He declared that the prenuptial agreement, and specifically Section 12, the Honor Clause, was fully valid and enforceable. He then turned his attention directly to Julian. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice booming with authority, in my 20 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated display of dishonorable conduct, deceit, and profound disrespect for the sanctity of a marital contract. Your attempt to defraud your wife, and then this court, is an affront to the principles of justice. The final verdict was swift and total. I was awarded 100% ownership of the house, my full pension, and 75% of all remaining marital assets. Julian was ordered to assume 100% of all personal and business debts he had incurred, and he was to pay all of my legal fees. As the judge's final words landed, Julian physically slumped in his chair, his head falling into his hands, a broken man, defeated by the truth. I felt a quiet exhale of breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I looked at David, who gave me a subtle, respectful nod. There was no triumphant smile, no fist pump. I didn't feel joy. An officer doesn't celebrate the successful completion of a necessary but painful mission. You simply acknowledge that the objective has been achieved. And you prepare for what comes next. Victory, I discovered, is a quiet affair. After the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, there was no triumphant parade, no celebratory dinner. There was only a profound sense of exhaustion, and the silent drive back to Diana's house. The war was over, but the battlefield was still littered with the wreckage of a 28-year-long life. Now, the work of reconstruction had to begin. News of the verdict spread through the Fort Liberty community like wildfire. Julian's carefully constructed social empire crumbled overnight. His business partners, who had already been spooked by the legal notices, severed all ties. The luxury apartment complex, facing the reality of a tenant who could no longer pay, began eviction proceedings. The fallout was swift and total. 2 weeks after the hearing, I heard from Diana that Kinsley had packed her bags and left, leaving behind nothing but a hastily scrawled note on the kitchen counter. Julian was left exactly as he had made himself, utterly bankrupt, both financially and morally, and completely alone. He tried calling, but his number was still blocked. His access to my life was permanently denied. A few days later, I returned to the house on my own. For the first time, it felt truly mine. The first thing I did wasn't to celebrate or cry. I walked through every single room and threw open all the windows, letting the warm Carolina breeze flow through, chasing out the stale air of old arguments and lingering deceit. It was a cleansing, a reclamation. The next day, I began the process of purging his presence. It wasn't an act of anger. It was a logistical operation, performed with the dispassionate efficiency of clearing out a barracks. I packed his expensive suits into donation boxes for Goodwill. His collection of self-important business books went into the recycling bin. His golf clubs, which he loved more than anything, were sold on Facebook Marketplace. I did it all with a strange sense of calm, a quiet finality. This wasn't about erasing the past, but about making space for a new future. His prized Mercedes convertible, the one that had been a symbol of his reckless spending, was the last to go. I sold it to a dealership, and the very next day, I walked into a bank and used the entire sum to open a new 529 college savings plan. The account name was simple: Serena Powell Graduate Fund. Each action I took was a deliberate step, a quiet declaration of independence. I was taking back my space, my money, and my life, one piece at a time. Among the mail that had piled up was a handwritten letter with a military postmark. It was from Captain Mark Renshaw, a sharp young officer I'd mentored a few years ago. I opened it, and his words brought the first genuine warmth I'd felt in months. "Colonel," he wrote, "the story of what happened has made its way through the ranks. I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for reminding all of us that honor isn't just a word we salute. It's how we live. You've set a new standard for us all." That letter meant more to me than the judge's verdict. It was a sign that my reputation, the one Julian had tried so hard to destroy, was not only intact, but had been forged even stronger in the fire. The final loose end presented itself a month after the hearing. I was at a local coffee shop, The Grind, reviewing some paperwork when a voice I never wanted to hear again said my name. I looked up. It was Julian. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by worn jeans and a polo shirt. He was thinner, his face gaunt and unshaven. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the desperate, haunted look of a man who had lost everything. He asked if he could sit down, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I nodded. He rambled for 10 minutes, a pathetic, disjointed monologue of excuses and apologies. He was wrong. He was a fool. He missed me. He wanted to try again. He wanted to come home. I listened patiently, without interruption. I didn't feel anger or pity. I felt nothing. He was a stranger to me now, a ghost from another life. When he finally ran out of words, his hopeful, pleading eyes fixed on mine, I took a calm sip of my latte. "Julian," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "I don't hate you. But what I also don't have for you anymore is respect. My forgiveness for you is this freedom I am giving you now. The freedom to walk away from the mess you made and try to become a better man. I sincerely hope you do." I paused, letting the words sink in. But our road together has ended. There is no coming back from this. I stood up, left a $5 bill on the table for my coffee, and walked out without looking back. That was our closure. No screaming match, no final tearful goodbye. just a quiet, absolute, and final boundary. That weekend, I hosted a small gathering at the house. It wasn't a victory party, it was a rededication ceremony. The guest list was small and carefully chosen: Diana, Serena, David Chen and his wife, and a handful of loyal friends from the Army who had never wavered, including Mark Renshaw and his family. We grilled burgers and hot dogs in the backyard. We drank local craft beer from Aviator Brewing Company and listened to classic rock on a portable speaker. We laughed. The sound of genuine, uncomplicated laughter filling the space felt like a benediction. This wasn't a celebration of an ending, it was the celebration of a new beginning. As I looked around at the faces gathered in my yard, illuminated by the soft glow of tiki torches, I realized I had redefined what family meant. It wasn't an obligation bound by blood or a legal contract. It was a fortress built of loyalty, honor, and unconditional love. This was my new unit, my chosen family. And for the first time in a very long time, I was home. The months following the court case were a time of quiet reconstruction, not just of my home, but of my life's purpose. I had spent 30 years serving my country, following orders and fulfilling the missions I was given. Now, for the first time, I had the freedom to write my own. 6 months after that fateful graduation dinner, I submitted my paperwork for early retirement from the U.S. Army. It wasn't a decision born of bitterness or exhaustion. It was a strategic redeployment. I left 30 years of distinguished service behind, not to retreat from the world, but to engage with it on a new front. Using a portion of the assets I had rightfully reclaimed, I founded a nonprofit organization. I leased a small practical office space in a modest building just outside the gates of Fort Liberty. The sign on the door was simple, printed in a clean, authoritative font: Powell Financial Command. My new mission was clear. I would use my expertise, my experience, and my scars to serve the community I knew best. Powell Financial Command was dedicated to providing pro bono financial counseling for military families, veterans, and most importantly, for the military spouses who found themselves facing the devastating crossroads of divorce or loss. The office wasn't glamorous. There was no expensive art on the walls, just framed informational posters about the GI Bill and VA home loans. But it was a place of safety, efficiency, and profound compassion. I spent my days helping young enlisted soldiers create their first budgets, guiding families through the financial complexities of a permanent change of station, and fighting for spouses who were being financially exploited in bitter divorces. My first client was a young woman named Sarah, barely 22 years old. Her husband, an Army sergeant, had been killed by an IED in Afghanistan just a month earlier. She walked into my office clutching a thick folder of official paperwork, her eyes wide with grief and confusion. She was drowning in a sea of acronyms: SGLI, DIC, TRICARE, while also trying to navigate the unimaginable pain of her loss. I spent 3 hours with her that afternoon. I sorted through the paperwork, explained what each form meant, and created a clear financial plan for her future. But more than that, I just listened. I listened as she told me about the day she met her husband, about their dreams of buying a small house, about the last phone call they ever had. In her story, I saw the echo of my own, a life built on service and sacrifice, suddenly and brutally upended. When she left my office that day, the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a glimmer of hope. In helping her find her footing, I solidified my own. I wasn't just an advisor anymore. I was a comrade, a commander, and an ally. The organization grew faster than I could have imagined. Word of mouth is the most powerful force in a military community. And the story of the colonel who was now fighting for them spread quickly. I was invited to speak at base town halls and family readiness seminars. I was no longer introduced as Julian Vance's wife, or even as Colonel Powell. I became known simply as the founder of Powell Financial Command, a title I'd earned, a reputation I'd built from the ashes of my old life. Serena, after graduating from Duke with high honors, made a decision that filled me with a quiet, profound pride. She turned down a lucrative job offer in Washington, D.C., and joined me, taking over the communications and outreach for the organization. Together, we were a formidable team. A mother-daughter unit transforming our family's painful past into a legacy of service. The story ends 1 year to the day after that night at the Garrison Bistro. I'm standing on the back porch of my house, a warm mug of coffee in my hands. The sun is just beginning to rise over the rolling hills of North Carolina, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. It's quiet, the only sound the gentle chirping of morning birds. I'm not thinking about Julian. I'm not thinking about the courtroom or the betrayal. The war is a distant memory, a closed chapter in a long book. My thoughts are on the day ahead, on the young military couple I'm meeting with at 9 a.m. to help them plan for their first child, and on the grant proposal Serena and I are writing to expand our services to other bases. I realize now that the cream-colored envelope I handed to the waiter that night wasn't an act of war. It wasn't the end of a story. It was my own self-authored set of orders, the first command of a new and far more important campaign. The mission to reclaim my life, my honor, and to use the strength I found in my darkest hour to serve others. I take a sip of coffee as the sun crests the horizon, flooding the world with new light. I have finally found peace. Not in victory, and certainly not in revenge, but in service, in my new mission. If my story proves anything, it's that the end of one chapter is not the end of the book. Every one of us has faced a battle that left scars. But those scars are not a sign of weakness. They are a testament to what you have survived. They are the foundation upon which you can build your next mission. If these stories of resilience and honor resonate with you, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who might need to be reminded of their own strength. Thank you for listening.